Здравствуйте, everyone. Happy Easter, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Sundays with Lenin. Each week, we try to do a relevant commentary on the current events and also see what Lenin had to say about it. And the reason why this works is because nothing has fundamentally changed that much since for the past 100 years or so. Capitalism behaves the same way over and over. It's just that we seem to get fooled. So let's see. The major events this week is AOC and her fundraising donations to the Democratic Party, Syria, and Anthony Blinken. Yeah, I mean, it's again the U.S. behaving like the U.S. always does with regards to Syria. And a lot of this stuff, the truth is just like under the surface if you just read it a little carefully. And today, our guest is Daniel Engelke from Villain of All Time podcast. And I hope you, and we're going to read the parts 1 and 2 of the Crisis of the Mensheviks. The main difference between the Mensheviks kind of thought, well, Marx and Engels mention how you need a large urban proletariat. And the large urban proletariat is created through capitalism, as in when the factories industrialize, they'll ruin the rural small producers. And when they go out of business, they have nothing to sell but their labor. And then they come to work at the factory, and then you get a concentrated urban population. Marx and Engels thought that you needed, once you get a urban population that's concentrated enough, you will eventually have a critical mass necessary to get a revolution. But Russia didn't have that because they only had started capitalism. So they had about 2 million urban workers and about 100 million peasants who were in slave-like conditions. So Lenin's idea was that let's get the peasants together, the rural peasants with the urban working class, and we'll have a revolution. And the Mensheviks were like, no, the peasants are too reactionary or whatever, and we need to align with the liberal bourgeoisie to overthrow the czar and then wait another 100 years for capitalism to develop until there's a big enough population. And so that's basically still the crisis of Menshevism, in that the Mensheviks want to align with the cadets, who are the Constitutional Democratic Party. And they're exactly like our Democratic Party. There's like nothing different about them. And so with that, I hope you enjoy this pre-record. And I will be back at the end with questions, comments, and anything else you want to talk about. Здравствуйте! Welcome to Sundays with Lenin. Today, we have Daniel Engelke, a freelance journalist who's written in Alternate and many other prestigious sources. He's written about the Obama drone wars, the Trump drone wars. This one was in the Trump drone war article is really good. It's in Who, What, Why. So welcome, Daniel or Dan Engelke.
Привет. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming. So tell us a little bit about, you said you're a journalist who does focus on anti-imperialism. And so tell us about what made you become a journalist, I guess.
That's a great question. Again, thank you for having me. I think it was probably around 2011, 2012, I would say got radicalized into politics, really following the NATO strike and overthrow of the government in Libya, really changed my opinion about what imperialism means beyond the traditional spectrum of left and right, Democrat and Republican. So since then, again, as you mentioned, Esha, that I've been writing about the drone wars under Obama as well as under Trump, which in my opinion were criminally underreported. Yes. I also wrote about some trade deals like the TPP that was happening in 2016 not to toot my own horn, but I really think that my article about Obama's final foreign trip as president really was a prescient when thinking about what led to Trump in 2016. I've also written about the sham of Russiagate, but in the context that the Trump administration was actually one of the hardest administrations on Russia, and how it was probably a psyop to restart the new Cold War. I've also written about social media censorship and how it's been more pressured on to it's a bipartisan push to, in my opinion, really censor alternative media that challenges the mainstream narrative.
For me, the biggest thing is that in 2012, Obama was criticizing China for not allowing Facebook and Twitter or whatever.
Yeah.
And now they're like, oh, it is. Now they are trying to, I forgot what the exact word was that Obama used, but they're like, oh yeah, now we've gotten too much information and we need some sort of censorship. And it's like, it just shows you that it's not a principled issue, but a partisan issue.
Well, absolutely. And then on that note, the Julian Assange case is really something, again, that is something I've also written about too. And I'm sure that you've been following this as well, but it's the fact that there was, I find this irony in that there was this huge push at the end of the Trump administration for people believing that the administration, his administration, would somehow pardon Julian Assange, which of course they wouldn't. They were one of the main people that prosecuted him. And then there's been no real push by the left, or anybody for that matter, to pressure Biden to pardon Julian Assange.
How do we pressure Biden to pardon? I agree with you that there needs to be a pressure, because the only thing he's done is revealed war crimes, and people who commit war crimes somehow get off. So like, what is the way you would suggest we put pressure?
I really don't know how we pressure Biden on anything. Honestly, I think that there's been this construction of viewing Biden in the context of his predecessor. So every time you want to bring up a criticism of Biden, it's like, well, look what Trump did. I mean, you got to give Biden a break. You know, he can't do everything in the first 100 days and things like that. So yeah, I don't know how to pressure him on anything at this point. And I feel like the press is just, they felt like they were such a persecuted group under Biden, under Trump. And now that they have this playground under Biden. So hopefully something will emerge.
Well, for me, the press's persecution was really ridiculous because, for example, New York Times said Trump has called us fake news, but then Maduro, Duterte, the Indian Prime Minister, Putin has all, and the thing about it is that they literally had lied about, had inaccurate information about all these people who they corrected. So while Trump was wrong, while they were wrong to call Trump fake news, they were every other person in the world who criticized them was absolutely right in that. Like with Putin, they even showed a screenshot to his website, and his website showed what's inaccurate about, they just made up a wild claim and it was completely inaccurate. And all they did was cite what actually happened in the Duma at that time, which is public record, which is on the video. Everyone can see it right now. You can go to the duma.ru or whatever their website is and check out what happened. And so, that's exactly the feeling I got, was that this fake, Trump was rude to them, but they don't seem to understand or care what persecution is. And it's allowed them to just do a false equivalency. Let me see if I can send you, I'll send it to Janet. I see that the press has gone super weak on Biden about everything.
They become very precious, very, very delicate in the way that they, under Trump, they felt like they were this persecuted group because he would say mean things about them. Whereas, they don't really care about Julian Assange. Did they really care about any kind of, they did care about persecution, I guess, under Obama, when ISIS apparently was chopping off heads and things like that. But it was more in the context to push action on ISIS rather than this care for journalism. So that might be a false equivalence, but I don't know. I feel like they've become not neutral, but almost like a cheerleader for Biden in every single way. Why do they do this? I just don't get it. I don't either. And obviously,
obviously the problem is that there is a limit on, like, if you get to work for New York Times, there is going to be there is a limit, their ideological limit, and they have to see everything through the ideological lens. Mm-hmm. But it seems like there is also a decline in standards too. Like it just, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I've been working on this article for years, and I hopefully I'm able to publish it at some point. But it's really talking about the pressures that this move from print journalism to digital journalism has caused a lot of media companies like the New York Times to have to conform their reportage to what an audience will like, right? You know, so you're reaffirming the echo chamber in that way.
Yeah. Well, I've also noticed what they do is it's more than the echo chamber, because they are also always 100% aligned with the State Department and never disaligned with the State Department. And so I have to feel like even when the State Department policy changes, they like slightly like move. For example, there was a FAIR article recently where apparently New York Times just made up a quote from, I believe, some Chinese official who didn't actually say anything. And it's like, it's really the worst was where this lady who worked for Falun Gong, which is kind of like a weird yoga Tai Chi cult. She wrote an article about how she thinks her grandmother was persecuted for being Uyghur, except that her grandmother was 1/4 Uyghur, and her entire thing was like race mixing is genocide or whatever. It's like, your grandmother, and that was published in New York Times. And I'm like, what is the standard? I mean, and it seems like it's always laundering State Department propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's like they need to keep that flow of information coming, I guess. You know, they get the leaks from the State Department, so they don't want to bite the hand that feeds, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, that explains it, yes. Mm-hmm. And they don't realize that that's not journalism just because publishing anything you get from the State Department as truth. Like, you have to investigate.
Without any scrutiny. Yeah, it's... Yes. And then I want to go back to fake news, because I think that is an interesting conversation. If only to remember that Hillary Clinton was the first person to say fake news. Okay. And start that wave. And then, yeah, like you said, that they tried it. They've always been doing fake news. Fake news is always it's a matter of perception. So.
Exactly. I mean, they've always had sometimes like there is just fake news, as in there were no incubator babies being thrown out in Iraq or whatever, Kuwait. Right. I mean, that's just made up. So for me, another important topic this week is AOC.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
The first thing I want to say is that the fact that this keeps happening over and over and over again is a political failure by both parties. And I want to be very clear about that, because I don't want to draw false equivalence. What is happening here is not the same as what happened during the Trump administration, where they took babies out of the arms of their mothers and deported their families and permanently traumatized these children, some of whom we don't know will ever be reunified with their family again, which is a level of human rights violation that is just simply not the same. Both of these things are barbaric and they're wrong. But when you rip a baby out of the hands of a mother, you cannot draw the same comparison. And anyone who is trying to do that is doing a profound disservice to the cause of justice. So I don't want to excuse any of this, but I don't think we should also get them twisted together, because one is not the same. And we cannot dust that under the rug. And by the way, those families are owed reparations, period.
Representative AOC on the border. What is happening here is not the same as what is happening during the Trump administration, where they took out babies from the arms of mothers. And like, apparently, like, whoever is falsely equivocating on that is doing a disservice, is what she said, more or less, right?
Yeah.
So thoughts?
And she said, no, it's not the same. And I can't justify this for any party. But here's a video of me justifying this for Joseph Robinette Biden.
Correct.
Yeah.
I want to hear your thoughts about this because I have quite a few thoughts, but go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for letting me kick it off. I've been talking with my friends about this just because, everybody's excited when the AOC came into Congress, and, she really did come with this firebrand spirit, which is really exciting to see. And I don't know if she's had a personal change, if she's been pressured by the Democratic Party to change, but I do feel like she's making these videos and trying to stop this comparison between Biden and Trump. It's like, that's fine. We don't have to compare the two, but you can still criticize both of them. You can still think both of them are bad in this policy. So, I mean, if people who told you that it was a harm reduction vote for Joseph Biden, especially with regards to the kids or any kind of refugees coming to the southern border, at this point, it looks like a lie. So I don't know. It's sad to see her cave on this policy specifically, but also just in general, it's been hard to watch.
Yes. And for me, later yesterday, we saw a Politico report that says that AOC has donated $5,000 to every swing district or whatever the DCCC calls them, the blue special, or I don't know, like they make whatever. Yeah. And the thing is that it seems like she has no conditions on that money. She has not said, you have to support Medicare for all. And she has not, she just seems to assume goodwill, like quid pro quo, she doesn't understand that they're not going to do that. I mean, they're going to just accept the money and stab her in the back, or if that's what the plan is. But it seems like it's based on a lot of assumptions and no coordination.
Yeah. And you also have to wonder why these people are in such contention, for getting elected. It's like, what policies have they advocated that have just not worked? And I don't know. I haven't actually seen which candidates are getting this money, but I'm wondering if it's a policy problem rather than a personality.
It's everything a problem. I mean, so somebody has studied this. This is James_Rowe. And he said, okay, so the people who are getting this are Tom Halloran, one of Arizona. He does not support Medicare. Basically, it's about 85% of the people there are not supporting Medicare for all. And this list includes neocons and CIA agents, like Abigail Spanberger. I thought she lost, but Abigail Spanberger actually dissed AOC and socialism, and she was a CIA agent. And Alyssa Slotkin, she's a CIA agent too. Tom Malinowski, he was a CIA agent also. What the hell?
Tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah, 3 CIA agents. I mean, I'm sorry. If you don't leak, you're not gonna. You can't be. You have to leak everything you did. Otherwise, you're not going to be accepted into our group, in my opinion.
I mean, what does democratic socialism mean if you're giving money to CIA agents? I just don't know.
I don't know, and it's like so. So it seems okay. So lucky for us, what AOC is doing is not that different from what happened in Tsarist Russia. And we can see why it was a failure. So let me just a lot of people don't understand the whole Bolshevik Menshevik split. But let me just quickly explain. Karl Marx and Engels talked about how as capitalism develops more and more industry, what happens is that the rural population empties out and it goes into the urban areas, and they start working low-wage factory jobs in urban areas. And England, for example, had about 100 or 200 years worth of capitalism. So by the time Engels died, about 70% of England, which is, Okay, never mind. Okay, the problem is that they're counting every colony, so it's like something like a billion. But
Yeah.
okay, we'll have to.
On number sets.
Yeah. If you add India, yes, it'll be like 500 million and whatever. But so if you, but in the a little island of Britannia, it was about like maybe 30 or 40 million people who were in the urban area. And Marx and Engels believed that if you have those 30 million people, all they need to do is like get together and kind of get their arms together and fight and overthrow the bourgeoisie, which is true. But unfortunately, let's put up a map of Russia now. Russia is much bigger, like much bigger. And it spans 2 continents and 11 time zones. And the thing is that capitalism as an industrial manufacturing was relatively new. And so Russia had about a population of maybe 2 million people who were the industrial proletariat. And they had about 100 million rural peasants whose life was equally miserable. And so, with regards to the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, Plekhanov and the Mensheviks thought that they kind of had to ally with the liberal bourgeoisie to help them overthrow the Tsar, and then let just capitalism develop forever, like until the rural areas emptied out in Russia, like wait, God knows how long, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. And then when the urban population became 20 million or 50 million, then they thought we needed to do a revolution. Lenin was like, what? No, we can't align with the liberal bourgeoisie. That's like, they're like scum. And what we should do is we should align with the rural peasantry where we have 100 million people who can fight. And with these 100 million people and the urban proletariat, we can overthrow the Tsar and get socialism and screw the liberal bourgeoisie. And so that was the essential argument between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Does this kind of sound familiar to you at all?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's like the same argument that the Democrats are having on whether or not to court the working white class. No, working class, the rural class. What is it? What do they call them?
Oh, I hate adding white to it. It just.
Well, it's fine, but we still definitely.
You know, it's the working class versus the managerial class.
Yeah. But the thing about it is that 70% of America is white. So you cannot do anything without white people. Like, it's just mathematically in the same way that you could not do anything in Russia without the 100 million peasants. Mm-hmm. We have more than 100 million white people who identify as white, like, or whatever. Right. Mm-hmm. And so it's the same exact argument. And it's been proven that liberal bourgeoisie, the professional managerial class, the New Yorkers are not revolutionary. It's those people that they have contempt for, like the West Virginia people and the interior. They're the real revolutionaries. So it's like we've had this argument before and it's been solved. And the thing is that the liberal bourgeoisie will never leave their class interests. But the second thing is that with the Mensheviks, they wanted to work with the Constitutional Democratic Party and to develop socialism. Does that sound familiar?
Drawing some parallels, yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I have to delete is the constitutional part because the Democrats we have don't even care about the Constitution.
They do not know.
Okay, so so we will be reading The Crisis of Menshevism. Mm-hmm. And so the non-party Labor Congress is basically, and the bloc with cadets is very self-explanatory. So this was right after the 1905 revolution, where the Tsar kind of capitulated and gave like a fake Duma. And the cadets wanted to run seats in the Duma. And the Mensheviks were like, yeah, let's align with the cadets and do their Duma. And Lenin thought that was a bad idea because basically he kind of understood where power came. So do you want to start with the reading part one?
Absolutely. The advocacy of a non-party labor Congress and blocs with the cadets is undoubtedly a sign of something in the nature of a crisis in the tactics of the Mensheviks. Being opposed on principle to all their tactics in general, we, of course, could not ourselves decide whether this crisis had ripened sufficiently enough to break out on the surface, so to speak. Comrade Y. Lauren has come to our assistance in his latest and most instructive pamphlet, A Broad Labor Party and a Labor Congress. And this was published in Moscow, 1906. Comrade Y. Lauren often speaks in the name of the majority of the Mensheviks. He styles himself, and with full right, responsible representative of Menshevism. He has worked both in the south and in the most Menshevik district of St. Petersburg, the Vyborg district. He was a delegate to the Unity Congress. He was a regular contributor to Golos, Truda, and Otakikli Sovremennosti. All these facts are extremely important in forming an opinion of the pamphlet, the value of which lies in the author's veracity, but not in his logic, in the information he supplies, but not in his arguments. And this is to kick off part one. That was just the introduction. A Marxist must base his arguments on tactics on an analysis of the objective course of the revolution. The Bolsheviks, as we know, made an attempt to do so in the resolution on the present situation, which they submitted to the Unity Congress. The Mensheviks withdrew their own resolution on this subject. Comrade Lauren evidently feels that such questions must not be shelved, and he makes an attempt to trace the course of our bourgeois revolution.
The bourgeois revolution is basically wanting just a constitutional monarchy. So the bourgeoisie weren't really happy with the Tsar because he was kind of crazy and not very stable, and he was just like Trump. So yeah, go ahead.
He divides it into two periods. The first, covering the whole of 1905, is the period of the open mass movement. The second, starting with 1906, is the period of agonizingly slow preparation for the actual triumph of the cause of liberty, the realization of the aspirations of the people. By the way, these are in quotes.
Yes,
in this period of preparation, the countryside is the decisive factor because its aid was not forthcoming. The disunited cities were crushed. We are experiencing an internal, outwardly passive seeming growth of the revolution. Mm-hmm. What is called the agrarian movement, the constant ferment which does not develop into widespread attempts at an active offensive, the minor struggles with the local authorities and landlords, the suspension of tax payments, putative expeditions, all these constitute the course most advantageous to the peasantry, not from the point of view of economizing forces, perhaps, which is doubtful, but from the point of view of results. Without completely exhausting the rural population, bringing it, on the whole, more alleviation than defeats, it is seriously sapping the foundations of the old regime and creating conditions that must inevitably compel it to capitulate or fall at the first serious test when the time comes. And the author points out that in 2 or 3 years' time, there will be a change in personnel of the police force and the army, which will be replenished with recruits from the discontented rural population. Our sons will be among the soldiers, as the peasant told their author. Comrade Lauren draws two conclusions. One, in the country, unrest in the countryside cannot subside. The Austrian 1848 cannot be repeated here. And two, the Russian Revolution is not taking the course of an armed uprising of the people in the real sense of the term, like the American or Polish revolutions. Let us consider these conclusions. The author's grounds for the first two are sketchy and his formulation of it too inexact. But in substance, he is not far from the truth. The outcome of a revolution will actually depend on most of all the steadfastness in the struggle of the millions of peasants. Our big bourgeoisie is far more afraid of revolution than of reaction. The proletariat by itself is not strong enough to win. The urban poor do not represent any independent interest. They are not an independent force compared with the proletariat and peasantry. The rural population has a decisive role, not in the sense of leading the struggle. This is out of the question, but in the sense of being able to ensure victory.
Okay, the reason why it is out of the question is because after the abolishment of serfdom, basically they set up all these land tenures and strange taxation systems that just kind of made them serfs, and they couldn't basically leave the property without the permission of their landlords and things like that. So that's why, on a practical matter, it's kind of hard when you're kind of enslaved to lead a revolution. Okay.
If Comrade Lauren had properly thought out his conclusion and had linked it up with the whole course of development of the social democratic ideas on our bourgeois revolution, he would have found himself confronted with an old proposition of the Bolshevism that he hates so much. The victorious outcome of the bourgeois revolution in Russia is possible only in the form of a revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. In effect, Lauren has arrived at the same point of view. The only thing that prevents him from admitting it is openly is that Menshevik quality which he himself castigates, namely hesitant and timid thinking. One need only compare Lauren's argument on the subject with those of the Central Committee's Stoltzer Democrat to be convinced that Lauren has come close to the Bolsheviks on this question. Stoltzer Democrat went to the length of saying that the cadets are the urban, non-estate, progressive bourgeoisie, while the Trudoviks are the rural, estate, non-progressive bourgeoisie. Stoltzer Democrat failed to notice the landlords and the counter-revolutionary bourgeois among the cadets, failed to notice the non-estate urban Democrats, the lower strata of the urban poor, among the
What's really interesting here is it's the exact same thing. The cadet party was basically a coalition of just kind of like urban New Yorkers who are pretty wealthy, like Upper East Side people. While the Trudoviks had a coalition of rural people who may not be the most politically correct, but they had material needs that needed to be improved from the Bolsheviks.
And if we're keeping score, it sounds like Lenin is saying that Lauren has come close, but will not move forward because of hesitant and timid thinking. Is this correct?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Yes. As in certain other people who are like the Democratic Socialists of America, who, basically they also, they can't. This week I was stunned by, I don't know what to say. But there's a Jacobin author who wrote basically something about why Kautsky was right. And I thought the piece was tongue in cheek and him being a contrarian troll, because most of us don't know who Kautsky is unless you read Lenin. And if you do read Lenin, the one thing you know is that Kautsky is it's never correct. But then he was trying to talk to Ryan, what's his name? Ryan Knight, about like coming on to Ryan Knight's show to discuss like what is the way to free themselves from the yoke. And then I mocked his piece and I said, what if there's somebody who wrote an exact manual on how to revolt, like something like what is to be done? And then he said, he literally said, who wrote that? And I was like, oh God, no. Kill me. And then I'm like, why the bleep are you writing a pro Kautsky piece when you like it? Just none of it made sense none of it made sense.
Yeah.
I was like, he doesn't know he hasn't read Lenin and he's writing a pro Kautsky piece. Why? Like, what? And that's the kind of timid thinking, because the entire thing with the social democrats is that they're saying that this system may, like, if you elect enough Democratic Party, like enough AOCs, you'll get a change. And I'm skeptical of that, because the problem is that the minute you elect an AOC, 3 years later, the AOC will turn into a Pelosi eventually, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason she called her Mama Bear.
Oh yeah. Not just, but it has nothing to do with the AOC per se. It has to do with the way Washington and the hegemony works, as in they're inside a bubble where they are where they're given this hope, where they're like, if you work hard, if you do this, and these random procedures, we're gonna actually pass Medicare for, like, no one's gonna say what, like, if AOC goes to somebody's office and says, hey, will you vote yes on Medicare for all? They will not say no, because they know Medicare for all is super popular. But what they'll say is like, the polling doesn't work or whatnot. And so she thinks that if she ticks all these boxes, that they will eventually vote for Medicare for all, but they won't, because that's not why they're not voting for it. It's because they don't do what their donors tell them not to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I before we get back to the piece, I think Biden mentioned it in his first press conference that politics is all about timing. It's the art of the possible. So I don't know what timing means for him when it comes to Medicare for all, but I think we'll be waiting quite some time.
Well, Bernie Sanders, essentially, if you listen to him carefully, He always says how, when asked how things are going to get done, he even he says that when millions of people come together, we can form like he basically essentially says you need a revolution to get moderate reforms is what he's saying. Yeah. A lot of people who are Bernie Sanders supporters just haven't listened to him carefully enough.
No, it's true. And like I was a big supporter of Sanders in 2016, and I'll admit I obviously he was my favorite choice in 2020, but he's not above criticism.
No, but I'm just saying that even if you listen to him carefully, he does tell the absolute truth in this one regard on how to get change. He always says when millions of people come together, you or I or any single person, one of us cannot do it. When millions of people come together, we're going to get a political revolution. So he's basically saying that even to get moderate reforms in our reactionary electoral body, we need a revolution. Is what he's saying, basically.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And they don't listen.
No, of course.
And but go ahead.
We are
to proceed. Lauren says
yes. To proceed, Lauren says that unrest in the countryside cannot subside. Has he proved it? No. Has he entirely left out account the role of the peasant bourgeoisie, which is being systematically bribed by the government? Has he given little thought also to the fact that the alleviations obtained by the peasantry, lower rents, curtailment of the rights of powers of landlords and the police, etc., are intensifying the breakup of the rural population into the counter-revolutionary rich and a mass of poor? Such sweeping generalizations must not be made with such scanty evidence. The sound trite.
Exactly. And ironically, I mean, Renan's like even now in America, in the rural population is definitely that. You have the big factory farms and a whole bunch of poor people, even today. Like it hasn't changed.
Yeah, absolutely. But can the proposition that unrest in the countryside cannot subside be proved? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that one can make a thorough analysis of probable developments. No, in the sense that one cannot be absolutely certain of these developments in the present bourgeois revolution. One cannot weigh the apothecary scales, the equilibrium between new forces of counter-revolution and revolution which are growing and becoming interwoven in the countrysides. Experience alone will completely reveal this. Revolution, in the narrow sense of the term, is an acute struggle, and only in the course of the struggle and in its outcome is the real strength of all the interest, aspirations, and potentialities displayed and fully recognized. The task of the advanced class in the revolution is to ascertain correctly the trend of the struggle, to make the most of all opportunities, all chances of victory. The class must be the first to take the direct revolutionary path and the last to abandon it for a more prosaic, more circuitous paths. Comrade Lauren has failed to understand this truth, although he argues at great length and, as we shall see below, not at all cleverly about spontaneous outburst and planned action. Let us pass to his second conclusion concerning an armed uprising. Here Lauren is even more guilty of timid thinking. His thoughts slavishly follow the old models, the North American and Polish uprisings. Apart from these, he refuses to recognize any uprising in the real sense of the term. He even says that our revolution is not proceeding on the lines of a formal and regular armed uprising.
Quotation, exclamation points between each.
Yes. How curious. A Menshevik who won his spurs in the fight against formalism is now talking about a formal armed uprising. If your thoughts are so crushed by the formal and the regular, you have only yourself to blame, Comrade Lauren. The Bolsheviks have always taken a different view of the matter. Long before the uprising and at the Third Congress, i.e. in the spring of 1905, they emphasized a special revolution, the connection between the mass strike and an uprising. The Mensheviks prefer to ignore this. It is in vain. The resolution of the Third Congress is actual proof that we foresaw as closely as was possible the specific features of the people's struggle at the end of 1905. And we did not by any means conceive the uprising as being the type of North America or Poland, where a mass strike would have been out of the question. Then, after December, we pointed out in our draft resolution to the Union Congress the change in the relation of the strike to the uprising, the role of the peasantry in the army, the inadequacy of local outbreaks in the armed forces, and the necessity of reaching an agreement with the revolutionary democratic elements among the troops.
So let me just quickly explain. What happened is that often if there was a rural peasant who was like unruly or not behaving well, the landlords themselves didn't really care. They just wanted to get rid of the problem. So what they would do is they would just send them to, because the Tsar required each gubernia to supply him with certain number of troops, they would just like send them to the army as a way of getting rid of them. So now the army had about a few 100,000 people who were the most rebellious and who were the least happy with the rural situation, which is what Lenin's talking about on how to change. He wanted to like then reach out to the army because all they needed to do was turn their gun the other side and you got a revolution. And that's basically what he meant by reaching the agreement with the revolutionary democratic element among the troops. And a lot of the army, high army people, by democratic elements, like they didn't really care. They wanted to get rid of the czar. Like that was the first thing. And they didn't really care if they had socialism after that, capitalism or whatever. It was just they wanted to they just want to get rid of the czar for billions of reasons. So Lenin wanted to appeal to them and say, hey, I know you want to get rid of the czar, but to these rural people, it doesn't matter if it's a czar or if it's like a British capitalist or some other feudal landowner. Their life sucks. To motivate them, you have to kind of go further than just getting rid of the czar. And so that's kind of what Lenin's talking about. And that's kind of, reminds me of the incrementalism debate, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So it seems like people don't understand that, like, while you can get more people to, in theory, to agree with you on the most incremental things, you can't get them to fight for you for incremental things. Like in order to get everyone to like turn, like the entire like majority of the army to turn their guns the other way, and also to get the peasants, 100 million of them, like you have to have like a very advanced program, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what people don't understand is in order to get change, sometimes it needs to be done through extreme measures. And you need to get a lot of people on board to not just agree with you, but to fight, as in come out and strike or do protests, write letters to Congress. And that's not going to happen unless they can see that it's worth it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think especially in present day, if we want to draw those parallels, the idea that like the media is just so powerful and prevents any kind of strike from at least getting press in the first place. You know, we're completely shut out from any kind of mass movement unless it's through social media, which, as we talked about before, is becoming increasingly censored against the left.
Oh, yeah. So we might have to do it the old fashioned way, which is what Lenin did is like newspaper subscriptions.
Absolutely. Okay. So we are returning again to, and events proved once again in the course of the Duma period, the inevitability of an uprising in the Russian struggle for emancipation. Lauren's arguments about a formal uprising display an ignorance of the history of the present revolution, or a disregard for the history and its specific forms of insurrection. That is most unbecoming for a social democrat. Lauren's thesis, the Russian Revolution is not taking the course of an uprising, shows contempt for the facts for both periods of civil liberties in Russia, the October and the Duma periods, were in fact marked by a course of uprisings, not of the American or Polish type, of course, but one characteristic of 20th century Russia, by arguing in general about historical examples of uprisings in countries where rural or urban elements predominated about American and Poland, and refusing to make the least attempt to study or even note the specific features of the uprising in Russia. Lauren repeats the cardinal error of hesitant and timid thinking of the Mensheviks.
And this is exactly what I see in a lot of people. For example, a lot of people say, like a lot of people just like say, oh, the only way we can do it is via electoralism, and there's no other way besides this. But the thing is, even in American history, like most of it has been gained from strikes and not electoral. And they also fetish this Scandinavian model. Guess what they did? They didn't just go magically from like a monarchy to a social democratic system. They fought hard for it. Mm-hmm. So, and it was outside of the electoral framework. And so it's like people are not making any note of what is special. Like, why are there millions of people who are miserable? Why is there majority of people making less than $30,000? Who are they? Like, how do they relate to the global capitalists? Like, there's no connection between anything. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I know in the public school system, which I was brought up in, we completely ignore the worker struggle in America. We never hear about the general strikes, the people that died. I think the most that you hear about is Sacco and Vanzetti, which is not really, in my opinion, it's without context in the whole worker struggle, which is really
I know in West Virginia, they just turned out the army. In Colorado, they bombed them. I mean, It was by class war. It was a lot of actual war, like actual guns came out.
Yeah, people died. You know, it's terrible.
The people's flag is the color red because of all the martyred dead. Go ahead.
Look deeper into his structure of passive revolution. Undoubtedly.
By the way, hold on. Passive revolution is the idea of basically aligning with the bourgeoisie liberals, and then kind of getting rid of the czar, and then like waiting until we get a right population and the conditions are just right, and then hopefully overthrowing them to get a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Wait a long time.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly, there may be long periods of preparation for a new upsurge, a new onslaught, or new forms of the struggle. But don't be doctrinaire, gentlemen. Consider what this constant ferment in the countryside means in addition to the minor struggles, the punitive expeditions, and the change in the personnel of the police force and troops. Why? You do not understand what you yourselves are saying. The situation you describe is nothing more nor less than protracted guerrilla warfare, and just interspersed with a series of outbursts of revolts in the army and of increasing magnitude and unity. You keep on using angry and abusive language about the guerrilla fighters, anarcho-blankist Bolsheviks, and so forth. Yet you yourselves depict the revolution as the Bolsheviks do. Change in the personnel of the army. It's remanning with the recruits from the discontented rural population. What does this mean? Can this discontent of the rural population clothed a sailor's jacket and soldiers' uniforms fail to come to the surface? Can it fail to manifest itself where there is constant ferment in the soldiers' native villages, where minor struggles on one side and punitive expeditions on the other are raging in the country? And can we, in this period of Black Hundred pogroms, government violence, and police outrages, conceive of any other manifestation of this discontent among the soldiers than military revolts? While repeating cadet phrases, a revolution is not taking the course of an uprising. This phrase was put into circulation by the cadets at the end of 1905. See Milyukov's Narodna Svoboda.
Narodnaya Svoboda, people's freedom.
People's freedom, got it. You at the same time show that a new uprising is inevitable. The regime will collapse at the first serious test. Do you think that a serious test of the regime is possible in a broad, heterogeneous, complex popular movement without a preliminary series of less important partial tests? That a general strike is possible without a series of local strikes? That a general uprising is possible without a series of sporadic, minor, non-general uprisings?
Okay, for this, people who use the general strike hashtag, yes, listen to Lenin. So before the general strike, try to do a local strike, or even like a party where you can get 10 people to come to your house. I mean, anything, because general strike doesn't happen spontaneously. General strike needs a lot of planning because it's the entire country, and you need a big apparatus to get the entire country to agree to go on strike. India is able to do this every 2 years, so I don't know what, but in America there is no apparatus like that, so you have to build it. So I just see all these people hashtagging, let's do a general strike, and they don't really know what they're talking about. Yeah, before the general strike, why don't you figure out how to do a local strike, your Twitter strike, something, right?
Actually, I don't know if you know anything about this, but with the India's farmers protesting, do you know if that's any part with how that was organized? You said that it happens every 2 years. Well,
no, not the farmers, but a general strike. Okay, so the farmers, what happened is that in India, India is not, a lot of people don't understand this, is not that traditionally, now it's different with the BJP, but traditionally India is not that different than China in the market socialist model. Mm-hmm. And so what was going on was that in the independence, farmers what they would do after the land reforms was that farmers would come and go to this intermediary body, and they would form, a price cartel where all of them would decide on the prices so that they don't get undercut, overproduced, etc. And then that intermediary body would then sell to the supplier, like Whole Foods or India doesn't have Whole Foods, but the idea is like because in America, what happens is that when you have Whole Foods go directly to the farmer, they'll say, we're going to pay you 30 cents per tomato, like per bushel of tomato, and that's it. And then the farmer had to sell it because it's rotten. It's going to rot. The farmer has to sell it to Whole Foods at whatever price they dictate, or they're screwed. But this is to like stop that from happening, is that there's an intermediary body that kind of does the same kind of cartelling with the farmers. And Modi wanted to get rid of that cartel. And so that's why the farmers were like, no, we won't let you do that, because that's going to mean that we're going to struggle and our farm produce prices are going to go down and down and down. So no, and that's why they had a farmer strike.
And just to conclude on that, is it still going on? From what I can, there's been almost zero coverage in the Western media.
I mean, the Modi withdrew the bill, but I mean, they are still a new set of like the strike is where they. So Modi abandoned the bill and is now trying to do a second level of watered down, like he's watered down that bill to second level. And now they are striking for that second level of so last week they were planning on a second strike to get rid of, like Modi didn't just abandon and go, boom, you were going to do like keep up Nehru's market socialism system. No, Modi's trying another level, like watered down a little bit. And they're like, no, we're not going to let that happen. So now there's going to be a second level of strikes.
Amazing.
Yeah. My favorite part is like somebody, I believe a Western reporter asked like one of the farmers, when do you plan on stopping? And he's like, we're planning on stopping after the revolution, sir.
Leaders have gone thrice they've gone, but they humiliated them and got back. So that's really sad. You know, and now they were absolutely, but they knew that we are coming on 26th and 27th. What they've done, they've given a meeting on the 3rd of December. So this is no way of handling such an agitation. ये इनकलाब है सर, ये revolution है. And if they are not going to understand the seriousness of this matter, trust me, it's going to be, it'll define the next political structure of this whole geopolitics of this entire country and South Asia. It's going to be really sad for them.
Let me see if I can find that video. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
She was so polite too. The farmer, like I've never seen like, yeah.
If recruits from the discontented rural, yes, I think that's right. Yeah. If recruits from the discontented rural population are increasing in the armed forces, and if the revolution as a whole is advancing, then insurrection is inevitable in the form of extremely bitter struggle against the Black Hundred troops. For the Black Hundreds are also organizing and training themselves. Do not forget this. Do not forget that there are social elements which foster Black Hundred mentality. A struggle for
Black Hundreds is like the KKK. More or less.
But connected with the Tsar, right?
Yeah. Well, okay. What they are, I mean, they are. Basically, the peasants are like, we don't want slavery anymore. And the and so the peasants would go on strike or just not till their land. And then the feudal landlords would bring in machine guns and just mow down everyone in the village. And so the Black Hundreds are basically that. So yes, they are connected with the Tsarist system, but I don't think the Tsar, they're like they are like more like a mercenary paramilitary troop as opposed to the Tsar's official troops.
Got it.
Okay, go ahead. A struggle.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah, a struggle both of the people and of a section of the armed forces. So it is necessary to get ready, to prepare the masses and to prepare ourselves for a more systemic, united, and aggressive uprising. That is the conclusion that follows from Lawrence premises. From his cadet fairy tale about passive revolution. Lenin admits that the Mensheviks put the blame for their own melancholy and despondency on the course of the Russian Revolution. Exactly. Passivity is the quality of the petty bourgeoisie intelligentsia, not of the revolution. Those are passive who admit that the army is being filled with recruits from the discontented rural population. that constant ferment and minor struggles are inevitable. And yet, with the complacency of Ivan Fedorovich Shpanka, consoled the Workers' Party with the statement, the Russian Revolution is not taking the course of an uprising.
Okay, Ivan Fedorovich Shpanka is a character from Nikolai Gogol's book. Mm-hmm. It's about a young man who is forced into the military, and then it's like what he and his and how he's unhappy, I guess. And he writes a diary about how terrible life is in the military. So that's what he means by the complacency of Ivan Fedorovich Shpanka.
Makes sense. And then
to console the work. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but what about the minor struggles? You, my dear Lauren, think that they are the course most advantageous to the peasantry from the point of view of results. You maintain this opinion in spite of the punitive expeditions, and even include the latter in the most advantageous course. But have you given even the slightest thought to what distinguishes this minor struggle from guerrilla warfare? Nothing, esteemed comrade Lauren. In your preoccupation with the ill-chosen examples of America and Poland, you have overlooked the specific forms of struggle engendered by the Russian uprising, which is more protracted, more stubborn, and has longer intervals between big battles than uprisings of the old type. Comrade Lauren.
Basically, in order to do the 1905 reforms or whatever, they had 40,000, like Lenin's done this thing where they had 40,000 strikes. And then I guess it took some time for them to build it up again. And so yes, it's been like, that's the way it's been.
Protracted and stubborn.
Yeah.
Right? Awesome. In your preoccupation with the ill-chosen examples, we did this one. Comrade Lauren has become completely confused, and in his conclusions Comrade Lauren has become completely confused, and his conclusions are all at 6s and 7s. If there are grounds for revolution in the countryside, if the revolution is expanding and drawing in new forces, if the army is being filled with discontented peasants, and if continual ferment and minor struggles persist in the countryside, then the Bolsheviks are right in their fight against shelving the question of an uprising. We do not advocate an uprising at all times and under all circumstances. Mm-hmm. But we do demand that the thoughts of a social democrat should not be hesitant and timid. If you admit that the conditions for an uprising exist, then recognize the uprising itself and the special tasks that confront the party in connection with it. To call minor struggles the most advantageous course, i.e. the most advantageous form of the struggle of the people in a specific period of our revolution, and at the same time refuse to admit that the party of an advanced class is confronted by active tasks which rise out of this most advantageous course, reveals either the inability to think or dishonest thinking.
Yeah, I mean, that is more or less my critique of AOC, in that she's, or every social democrat or every democratic socialist or whatever they want to call themselves, in that they seem to think that just like electing a few representatives is, look, it's pretty passive and that's all they need to do, as opposed to educating their own ranks about theory or even having a platform. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that like one advantage, and I think about this a lot with like Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter started in the Obama years. And thanks to Trump, in a way, there was a real enemy in the White House today, right? And now there's been a lot of jokes about the back to brunch Democrat after Trump is gone. And you really are starting to see that, but in the most unlikely places. And I mean that specifically with the squad. You know, they've just become more of like apparatchiks to the party. And like, I appreciate, you know, the sentiment that got them there, but it's just sad to see. And I just, what is your opinion? What do you think happened? Nothing happened.
That's just because of the way the hegemony works in America. If you do nothing, this is the inevitable course. So what they needed to do with Justice Democrats or Democratic Socialists or whatever other whatever other organization is to kind of train them ideologically to resist and also have a plan. Because ultimately, if you look at the House rules, Nancy Pelosi more or less gets to decide what to bring to vote and what to shelve. So AOC herself does not have much power. What she does have is an Instagram following, and she can totally bring random bills like World Peace Act and then show how it gets shelved and how Koch brothers peace gets voted on. And that itself is a great way to raise the consciousness of the American people. And so, A, they don't know what kind of tasks they have to do. And B, they came to Congress, but they think that they need to work within the work within Congress, and become follow the congressional ladder, to join committees, et cetera. But that's not where they're useful in, because we know that none of this actually ends up changing anything because of the way everything works. So what they need to show is that even if we're here, nothing changes. You guys need to do the rest. And that's what they're not clear on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Ultimately, America's we have one of the oldest systems in the world. Like almost every country got out of their feudal system or whatever. And so it to me, it just takes a second. Who created the system? Genocidal slave owners. And why did they create it? Oh, let's look at what exactly they said. James Madison said that the purpose of the Congress and Senate is to protect those with property from those, I guess, without, but he means those who were property. And how do you expect it to spit out anything besides more genocidal slave owners? Even that kind of it takes just a second to think, but it seems like none of them have even given that thought.
No, not at all. Yeah. And, not to throw you a completely question out of left field here, but before we get into section 2, do you mind if we talk about Syria for a second?
Not at all. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I noticed something this week that I think I shared in our chat about Secretary of State Anthony Blinken pushing for more humanitarian assistance into Syria. And
I already have 2 questions.
Yeah.
What does the humanitarian assistance look like? Is it guns? Is it explosive? I don't know.
Yeah, no. Okay. Was question 1? What is question 2?
To whom in Syria does he want to push this alleged humanitarian assistance? Yeah,
exactly. And I think that he made this speech at the UN and took some shots at Russia and China for so-called blocking the borders to Syria, what's up?
There's only one border, Turkey. No.
Yeah. That's the one that's open. I guess there's 2 others that
Jordan won't let them, right? No, Jordan and Lebanon won't let them.
Right, exactly. And he mentioned that Russia had bombed hospitals and what else? Just denying food and I don't know.
Okay, so there's the Iraq border that they can kind of do whatever they want, but so I guess but Iraq also kind of doesn't let them as freely as the Turkey border.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I guess I'm just upset because of the way this is probably covered. I think I shared the New York Times article which mentioned that they were it was like a move for more productive reproductive rights for women, which of course is great. I'm a little
Syria?
Yeah. Well, it was supposed to be internationally.
Hold on. So there's 2 problems with this. The first thing is they don't understand that the way Americans look at reproductive right is a bourgeoisie thing. In Asia, abortions are knee procedures. It's not that big of a deal. And in fact, there's some fatwa from one of the the Shia Ayatollahs where he totally says it's cool to get an abortion if you're worried about getting too fat. So it's not the same. That's just a Western way of looking at things. Abortion does not have the same taboo. Premarital sex is still really frowned upon, but you're not going to get people to stop frowning upon that anytime this century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I guess I'm just upset again. I'm upset the way that this is covered, on the premise of reproductive rights. And as you said, it's a Western concept, especially in regards to Eastern ways of thinking about this, or Middle Eastern ways of thinking about this. But then, I think I shared that Al Jazeera article as well, just as a different focus, because that was actually the second part of that New York Times article was about pushing for humanitarian assistance, whereas I think that is the bigger story. And I'm not promoting Al Jazeera here or anything, but
no, go for it. I don't care.
Yeah. No, it's just interesting, and I'm wondering what you think about media focus on Syria and what it will probably look like. What Biden's Syria policy will probably look like.
Oh, horrific. I mean, it'll probably be just like Obama, his other previous Syria policy. But what it seems like is that, Russia allegedly bombed a few hospitals in Idlib. Well, no, Russia didn't. The Syrian government did, but whatever. But I mean, we're rebel-held region. I don't know what were they using the hospital as a hospital? I don't know. But white helmets. Anyway, yeah. So it seems like there's a lot of disingenuous framing about who's being bombed. So it seems like the Syrian government is not Russia. So that's kind of weird to like conflate the two. And then, yes, they did. But it's like, it's a little different because ultimately it's part of Syria and it's a civil war, but the US is a lot more cavalier. Like, I just don't see that the US, I mean, they bombed the last hospital in Kunduz. So, right. And constantly Doctors Without Borders keeps on getting bombed. So it seems like the US government is upset that Russia and China are making it hard for them to send supplies over to moderate rebels. And the press is not being honest about who these moderate rebels are.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I wonder what it's going to look like in the upcoming months, the upcoming years, because I'm sure that there's going to be a new assault. I mean, it's not like it really stopped under Trump. It was just, it was a scandal every week with him, but it wasn't so much foreign policy. But in my opinion,
Trump also, like, I don't know if you remember, but I remember like in 2017, when he first bombed Syria, you get like Fareed Zakaria and Brian Williams all talking about, oh, today's the day that Trump looks like he's the president, right?
Yeah. God.
And then the beauty of the bombs.
Yeah. He dropped Moab too, not in Syria, but the mother of all bombs. I think that was in Afghanistan.
Yeah. And then there's also a false equivalence of what Russia is doing versus what the US is doing. And the main difference is that Russia is there to protect the Syrian government from the US. And yeah, I mean, there's no way out of it. And so, yeah, it seems like there is, it seems like it's a typical American racism where they don't care enough about the foreign country to actually learn about all the intricacies of that country and what has happened in the past 400 years, thanks to colonialism, the United Kingdom, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, like whatever. There's like so much intricacies to learn. They don't care to learn. And then they don't also realize that they haven't learned and they just have defaulted to the State Department understanding too. And that's the worst combination.
Absolutely.
And after you talked about this, I bet you and I will both get accused of being funded by Assad. Unfortunately, we're not, but if Assad's listening, please fund us.
I will take any money. Seriously.
Yeah, exactly. Please fund us. Okay, go ahead.
I just want you to get before we jump into part 2 of the crisis of Menshevism, can we talk about just wrap up part 1 and exactly what he's talking about?
Yeah.
Lenin is discussing.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So what Lenin is discussing is that, as I said before, the Mensheviks were, so the Tsar had a fake Bologna Duma. The Constitutional Democratic Party is a liberal bourgeoisie party, kind of like our Democratic Party. And the Mensheviks were saying that our strength, as in the number of people we have in our movement, is not big enough to actually dislodge the Tsar. So we need to align with the non-party Labor Congress, and form a bloc with the cadets. Basically, like doing what AOC did, like what the Democratic Socialists are doing with like AOC and the Squad, which is forming a non-party Labor Congress, which is kind of like the Democratic Socialists, and a bloc with the cadets, as in exactly what like entryism. And the reasons why he gives it is that he's basically saying that the peasants in Russia are not advanced enough to, they were not armed. I mean, they had nothing but like the proverbial hammer and sickle. I mean, that's where they get the sickle, is that's the only weapon they had, and they fought. But Lenin's saying that, so he's saying that we can't really, so Lauren is saying we can't reach these rural people. They're too far away. They're not advanced. It's too hard. We can't convince them. And so we should align, Lauren is just saying we should align with the liberal bourgeoisie until basically capitalism empties out the rural area and brings all these rural people into the urban areas. And Lenin is saying that the liberal bourgeoisie won't even help you overthrow the czar because they secretly support him, kind of like the Democratic Party and Trump. And B, the reason B, it's actually, if you really want a revolution, you can't think passively and let just the regime just collapse. You need to basically make it happen. And the only way that can happen is if you unite with the rural population, with the urban bourgeoisie, urban proletariat, as in in America, the equivalent would be poor people in New York City or Chicago, and the who align with poor people in Buffalo and Syracuse, and because they have the same class interests and they're kind of willing to fight. There might be cultural issues with regards to the rural peasant who might be more conservative, who might be super Christian, or whatever. But Lenin says you can actually convince them to be more progressive and be more most of the rural peasants just wanted their plot of land and not to be under slavery. But Lenin was saying, yes, we can do that, but we can also convince them why socialism is cool, on top of just making sure that they have their land and they're not slaves. So that's kind of it's literally the exact same argument we've been having for the past 100 years. And Lenin now explains why not waiting until basically the theory of passivity is just waiting and waiting and waiting until you have capitalism take over and take over and take over. And then capitalism empties out the rural population, because the first thing it does is that, you've seen this in America too, right? Because the factories are all concentrated in one area. So people just have to leave the rural areas to go find jobs in the cities, and then they're all concentrated. But that doesn't happen immediately. That happens over the course of, God knows, 20, 30, 50, even 100 years. Yeah. So in 1905, like I said, the urban population in Russia was about 2 million, the urban proletariat, while the rural peasantry was 100 million. And so Lenin's saying we have about 100 million people who are totally discontent with this regime, and they will totally help us. So you don't have to align with the liberal bourgeoisie and kind of do compromises. So with the liberal bourgeoisie, there's so many compromises that you don't have to do it if you align with the rural peasants, because the rural peasants really just want, the rural peasants don't want to take over. The liberal bourgeoisie just wants a kinder, gentler czar. They're going to be a kinder, gentler czar, while the rural peasants just kind of want to not be slaves anymore. And that's basically what Lenin's saying. And this is the exact same argument we're having for the past God knows how long. And so that's why, even Chuck Schumer said something what did he say? For every, something in Pittsburgh, we lose. For every white working class in Pittsburgh we lose, we'll get so many more seats in Pennsylvania, or I forgot, Philadelphia or something like that. Yeah.
It was comparing the losing rural votes and gaining
but he didn't, because the liberal bourgeoisie is reactionary and bad, and their class interests won't let them be convinced.
It's true.
Exactly. And so that's the thing again. And this is a nice thing to look at, because this is the same argument that everyone's been making since then. And they've been forgetting and remaking it and re-forgetting and remaking it. And so Yeah, and here Lenin really clearly explains why logically their argument won't work. And then once they understand why logically it won't work, when it fails again for the 110th time, they can also see it empirically not working. And that's why I brought this over, is because the idea of aligning with the liberal bourgeoisie party, the Constitutional Democratic Party in Tsarist Russia, failed for this reason. And now I want people to look at Lenin's reasons and then compare it to why the squad, no matter what they're in, like Lauren is probably had better intentions than everyone in the squad. And even he was led astray. Like every Menshevik, I would say, is much more progressive and much better intentioned than anyone in the American left. So and even them, it got that, like even with their intentions, this strategy failed. And so I just wanted people to look at the reasoning behind why it fails, and then use that to match it up with the current day's actions to see if the reasoning still holds.
Absolutely. And I don't want this to be a spoiler, but what happened to Lauren?
Nothing.
It's
not, nothing's in history as a spoiler. Basically, he got nothing really. Okay. So he later becomes the head of the Soviet. He basically agrees that Lenin's right, and then he becomes the head of like some sort of economic program in the Soviet Union. And then he becomes opens up this society for toiling Jews on the land or something, and then nothing really. I mean, he actually recognizes that Lenin was right, and he just kind of he becomes an economist and really ends up like actually doing. I don't know what else to say.
Amazing. No, yeah, I'm glad that he was able to be persuaded.
Well, I mean, yeah. So I don't know how he dies, but I'm guessing it's probably like old age. I mean, back in 1932. How many years? 60 years? No, 20 plus 30. 50. Okay. He died about like at age 50. So yeah, it sounds like, I don't know what else to say about him.
Yeah. Okay. Part 2. A theory of passivity is the term that might be applied to Lauren's arguments about a passive revolution that is preparing the collapse of the old regime at the first serious test. And this theory of passivity, a natural product of timid thinking, has left its mark on the whole pamphlet of our penitent Menshevik. He asks, why, concerning its enormous ideological influence, is our party so weak organizationally? It is not, he replies, because our party is a party of intellectuals.
Okay. Lenin is mocking this because the Mensheviks were a party of intellect. Well, a lot of these quote unquote smart people were the Mensheviks, while the Bolsheviks were like more like what Americans might sneer at the modern day proletariat, like calling them white trash or whatever. Like that's kind of like who Lenin organized. And so Lenin is making fun of their intellectualism.
Love it. This old bureaucratic Lauren's expression explanation of the Mensheviks is quite worthless because objectively, in the present period, there has been no need for a different kind of party, and the objective conditions for a different kind of party have not existed. Because for a policy of spontaneous outburst, such as the policy of the proletariat was at the beginning of the revolution, no party was needed. All that was needed was a technical apparatus to serve the spontaneous movement and spontaneous moods, to conduct propaganda and agitational work in the intervals between revolutionary outbursts. This was not a party in the European sense, but a narrow 120,000 out of 9 million association of young working class conspirators, few married men. The majority of the workers who are ready for public activities are outside the party.
This reminds me exactly of the DSA. A lot of young working class conspirators, few family people. Family people have a different consideration, so they're not really into like spontaneous outbursts. They kind of want a good plan.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Now the period of spontaneous outbursts is passing away. Calculation is taking the place of mere temperament. In place of the policy of spontaneous outburst, a policy of planned action is arising. Now we need a party of the European type, a party of objectively planned political action. In place of an apparatus party, we need a vanguard party that would be the rallying point for all those suitable for active political life that the working class can produced from its ranks. This is the transition to a European party based on calculated action. The sound realism of European social democracy is taking the place of official Menshevism with its half-hearted and hesitating measures, its despondency and failure to understand its own position. Its voice has been making itself quite audible for some time now through Plekhanov and Axelrod. Strictly speaking, the only Europeans in our barbarian environment.
Okay, this is really funny because Lenin's using your white boy or European as an insult. He's like saying Plekhanov and Axelrod are the only Europeans in our barbaric movement. So Lenin uses, Lenin's, I think, the first one to use European as an insult, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, he's making fun of them for like thinking in the European sense, like for their Eurocentrism. And yeah, Lenin always calls himself an Asiatic barbarian and later we should read this piece another day, but there's a funny troll that Lenin goes and asks China to invade Europe and bring in freedom.
Amazing. Yeah, let's read that someday.
Okay, go ahead. We'll put the link below. Okay, go ahead.
We are
in you're only European, like Plekhanov and Axelrod, strictly speaking, the only Europeans in our barbarian environment.
And of course, the substitution of Europeanism for barbarianism promises success in place of failure. Wherever spontaneity prevails, mistakes in judgment and failures in practice are inevitable. Where there is spontaneity, there is utopianism. Where there is utopianism, there is failure.
Okay, Lenin insult. This is my favorite Lenin insult that I call everyone these days. Go ahead.
Yes. In these arguments of Laurens, we see again the glaring discrepancy between the tiny kernel of a correct, although not new idea, and the enormous husk of sheer reactionary incomprehension. A spoonful of honey in a barrel of tar.
This is basically everyone I see is like a tiny kernel of truth with like sheer reaction, like every anarchist, like everyone on like every Democratic Party apparatchik on Twitter is basically an enormous husk of sheer reactionary intervention. So this is, I've like memed this and used this on every tweet, on about 100 tweets already. So yeah, this will be our weekly Lenin insult.
Yes. It is an unquestionable and indisputable fact that as capitalism develops, as experience of bourgeois revolution or revolutions, and also of abortive socialist revolutions accumulates, the working class of all countries grows, develops, learns, becomes trained and organized. In other words,
one thing that people don't understand is working class is specific. Like with Lenin, words have meanings. It's not crap that he brings up like Biden or whatever. So the working class is the proletariat class who basically, according to Lenin's definition, let me get this right out. What does Lenin call them? Hold on. Someone who cannot subsist except by selling their labor. And so this is what... So you have to read his other piece, Development of Capitalism in Russia, which is true for every other country, because the way the factories are based on, I guess, the laws of physics and machinery, and that doesn't magically change just because you're in Russia versus the US. So basically what happens is that you have to get the ruin of the rural population by like flooding it with like goods. Cheap goods. When they go out of business, they'll need the job. And so as the working class grows, he means as people become impoverished and then they have to run and get a factory job. That's what he means. So, and then develops, learns, becomes trained and organized is like when the working class, after they get their job, they join the union. That is organized, and the union teaches them how to actually fight for their rights, and that becomes trained. Learns and develops is learning from the union and then passing it on. So yeah, this is so read it with like understanding that with Lenin, like words mean things.
Absolutely.
In other words,
it advances from spontaneity to planned action, from being guided merely by mood to guidance by the objective position of all classes, from outburst to sustained struggle. All this is true. It is as old as the hills and is applicable to Russia of the 20th century as to England of the 17th century, to France of the 30s of the 19th century, and to Germany at the close of the 19th century.
And the United States of the 21st century.
Hey, yeah. But the trouble with Lauren is that he is quite incapable of digesting the materials which our revolution provides as social democrat. Like a child with a new toy, he's entirely taken up with contrasting the outburst of Russian barbarism with European planned activity. Uttering a truism that applies to all periods in general, he does not understand that his naive application of this truism to a period of direct revolutionary struggle becomes with him a renegade attitude towards the revolution. This would be tragic comical if it were not that Lauren's sincerity left no shadow of doubt that he is unconsciously echoing the renegades of the revolution. Actually, I just want to ask a quick question. With the European planned activity versus this so-called Russian barbarism, was this just this something I heard when I was studying Russia as a kid? This want in a lot of like Russian circles, probably middle class and upper class circles, to be accepted by Europe.
Yeah, I mean, that's what, if you look at all of those, so we'll put a link, but if you look at Arkady Arichenko, it's a very, they wanted to seem European, sophisticated. And Lenin rejected that idea of being European. He's like, no, we are Asiatics. Majority of Russia is in Asia. We are Russian and it's our culture. And we don't have to be like Europe. And so he rejected that. So he, like in another piece, you'll see he makes fun of somebody for calling it St. Petersburg as opposed to Petrograd. And a lot of the like the Tsar's lackeys, they were trained in Europe and they were like, oh, Europe is so much superior than our Asiatic Russia. So yeah, it was a very colonial attitude. And it's funny because as an Indian, I identified the same attitude amongst like a lot of the Indian bourgeoisie. So, you can see a lot of them were like, oh my God, I studied in Oxford and then we learned so much in England. And then you're like, oh, screw you. So yeah, they don't understand. Yeah, so there is a lot of like Eurocentrism amongst the Mensheviks, and Lenin's always making fun of them for that.
I love it. And spontaneous outbursts of barbarians, planned activity of the Europeans. This is purely cadet formula and a cadet idea. The idea of the traitors to the Russian Revolution who go into raptures over constitutionalism, like Muromstev, who declared the Duma is part of the government, or the lackey Rodikev, who explained it is presumption to hold the monarch for the pogrom.
This reminds me of Biden's concentration camps. And what's the new word for Biden's concentration camps? I forgot.
Pods?
Yeah, child pods or whatever.
Oh my God.
Like it is presumptuous to hold a monarch. Yeah, that's exactly like the argument that people who support Biden's concentration. No, they have a new word. Jenna, do you remember what the new word is for Biden's concentration camp?
I can't remember because we were using this, but
okay, let me remember this. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Hold on. One last thing I want to say about the AOC video, since this just came up again. The administration prohibited people from taking any photos or even visiting the camps. I just can't, she made that video in full knowledge of that. So.
Oh, wow. Okay. The migrant childcare facility. I don't know what they are, but whatever. I can't remember. There's a new name for it, though. You have to use that. Otherwise, you're going to be accused of being a Trump supporter. Oh, yeah. True.
Keep it in, though. No. But the trouble with Lauren is that he's incapable of digesting these material. Spontaneous outbursts of barbarians playing activity. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. Go ahead. The cadets have created a whole literature.
The cadets have created the whole literature written by renegades. The Izogoyevs, Struyevs, Prokopovich, Protogolovs.
Portugalovs, as in like he's probably like has Portuguese ancestry. It's tutti quanti, and everyone who matters, everyone who counts. Tutti quanti means everyone who counts.
Nice. Who have reviled the folly of spontaneity, i.e. revolution. The liberal bourgeoisie, like the famous animal in the fable, is simply unable to lift his eyes and understand that it is only due to the outburst of the people that we still possess even a shadow of liberty.
This is exactly like the Democratic Party when they condemn riots and riot mongers or like all about the violence and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And Lauren, naively uncritical, trails behind the liberals. Lauren does not understand that there are two sides to the question he raises. One, the contrast between a spontaneous struggle and a planned struggle of the same dimension and forms. Two, the contrast between a revolutionary, in the narrow sense, period and a counter-revolutionary are only constitutional period. Lauren's logic is atrocious. He contrasts a spontaneous political strike not to a planned political strike, but to a planned participation in, say, the Bourguignon. Yeah. He contrasts a spontaneous uprising not to a planned uprising, but to planned trade union activity. Consequently, his Marxist analysis is converted into a flat Philistine apotheosis of counter-revolution.
I like that, apotheosis of counter-revolution. That's a good term. Like Lenin the apotheosis is the apex or the climax. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Lenin's also good to copy and paste for Twitter insults, and then you won't get suspended from Twitter.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, Lauren here, it seems like he does believe in the Duma, right? Am I reading this correctly? Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly like Lenin's official term for this is constitutional illusions.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. European social democracy is the party of objectively planned political activity, prattles Lauren ecstatically. Oh, child, does not notice that he is going into raptures over the particular limited field of activity to which the Europeans were compelled to confine themselves in a period when there was no directly revolutionary struggle. He does not notice that he is going into raptures over the planned nature of a struggle waged within legal limits, and decrying the spontaneity of a struggle for the power and authority which determine the limits of what is legal. He compares the spontaneity uprisings of the Russians in December 1905, not with the planned uprisings of the Germans in 1849 and the French in 1871, but with the planned growth of the German trade unions. Interesting. He compares the spontaneity. He compares the spontaneous and he compares the spontaneous and unsuccessful general strike of the Russians in December 1905, not with the planned and unsuccessful general strike of the Belgians in 1902, but with the planned speeches of Bebel or Van der Velde in the Reichstag. Do you know much about the general strike of the Belgians in 1902?
No, let me see. Okay, Lenin says this. Belgian general strike was declared in April 1902 in support of the demand for universal suffrage raised in the Belgian parliament by representatives of the Labour, Liberal, and Democratic parties. More than 300,000 workers took part in the strike. Demonstration by the workers occurred throughout the country. But after the parliament had rejected the electoral reform bill and the troops had fired on the demonstrators, the opportunist Labour Party leadership, Van der Velde and others, capitulated. And under pressure from their allies in the liberal bourgeoisie camp, called off the general strike. That sounds so familiar. The defeat of the Belgian working class in April 1902 was a lesson to the international labor movement. The socialist proletariat, wrote Iskra in number 21 of June 1st, 1902, will see the practical results that follow from the opportunist tactics which sacrifice revolutionary principle in the hope of quick success. The proletariat will have yet another proof that it will not be able to achieve its aim by any of the methods of political pressure used against the enemy unless it is prepared to carry these methods to their logical conclusion.
Ooh, nothing like a Lenin burn.
Yeah, and it's true. Everywhere. Right? Yeah, so that's what happened. So go ahead.
That is why Lauren fails to understand the historic progress of the mass struggle of the proletariat, signalized by the strike in October 1905 and the uprising in December 1905, whereas the retrogression of the Russian Revolution, temporary on his own admission, expressed in this necessity of preparation activity within the limits of the law, trade unions, elections, etc. He elevates into progress from spontaneous planned activity, from moods to calculation, etc. Okay,
so what he's doing is that he's basically kind of doing what every Democratic Party person does, like where they're like, don't strike, like run for election. So he's basically, like, it's this argument we've seen a billion times, but Lenin's saying, no, these are two separate spheres of activity. So while the people are like resting and figuring out what to do, We need to have some preparatory activity within the limits of laws, like running for elections, having a billion ALCs run. But while that happens, we really need to kind of plan for direct action, like strikes, or there's thousands of direct actions, like way back in ancient Egypt, because like people who worked in the pyramid like shut themselves inside the pyramid when the pharaoh died, so that until they got like all these like gold. So there's lots of creative things that they have to do, but that has to be done through study of the different ways, like different ways in which the environment works, and what works in Alabama might not work in New York, but it has to be done. So what he's saying is that just because they strike doesn't mean it's lawless. Well, it is lawless, but the strike is actually like doing something different than the trade union struggles, while Lauren seems to look down upon strikes and saying the only way is electoralism and trade unionism is kind of like the gist of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And Esha, just on that note, have you noticed anything in contemporary society where creative direct action lately?
In which country?
Anywhere.
In India, I have. So like a few months ago, there was there was like some dumb BJP like law that about like women. I forgot what it was, but basically 500,000 women just like locked themselves, like not lock as in like held hands and like just blocked the streets. And then they capitulated because but in India, what I noticed is that it's a lot easier because there's a lot more people. And if you like just like stop things from going on the street, like if you stop traffic, it's really going to like harm the global like supply chain enough to like make them capitulate, I guess. Unfortunately, in the US, I don't know what Americans can do to, because of how manufacturing has kind of been outsourced. So is it even possible without people in like, say, India, Bolivia, China, Vietnam? Like, I don't know what's possible. And so that's why I don't see much in the US, because it doesn't seem like it's based on any kind of study or logic of anything. And it's like, for example, with Amazon, the delivery drivers, like, one thing that is the democratic socialists, who have an extraordinary number of petty bourgeoisie in their ranks who know how to program, could do like an alternative driver app, right? Like,
yes.
But they won't, because they're not even thinking in this term.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I'm wondering like why people. I know why people like AOC don't point to India or Bolivia or any of these places where you're
racism. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that she would get a ton of backlash, but she's, I don't know. It's too
well. It's basically like there's so much. I mean, there's so much racism in American society that they don't even realize it. Like heck, even screw that. Like, let's even look at like the way London's hanging. Like they've had this like there's a new groping bill that the police want to do in London. Just look at them. Like they're a lot more effective. And I don't know. But with regards to third world countries, it's like they're not trying to be openly racist, but they just don't know that they're racist. And they're just like, oh, what do these like Indians have to teach us? I mean, we're just like we're just like the oldest civilization, but whatever. and that's the exact same thing with like Bolivia. Like, what are these like Andean people who have had a civilization longer than almost any other human have to teach us? And it's like a lot, because they've been around for millennia. You just started. Yeah. So this was
so we are in this is why, in the place of mortal drawn by revolutionary Marxists, that instead of a spontaneous political strike, we must have planned political strike. Instead of a spontaneous uprising, we must have a planned uprising. We find the mortal drawn by a renegade cadet. Instead of the folly of spontaneity, strikes and uprisings, we must have systemic submission to the Stolyopin laws and a planned deal with the Black Hundred monarchy.
That is basically, the Stolyopin laws are just like the crazy, like they're just like any American like crazy reactionary laws you've seen about. Like that's like anti-strike law. It's okay, legal to run down protesters, that kind of stupid stuff. And the Black Hundred is like the paramilitary, which is the police in our country, I guess.
Yeah. No, Comrade Lauren, if you had mastered the spirit of Marxism and not merely its language, you know the difference between revolutionary dialectical materialism and the opportunism of objective historians. Recall, for instance, what Marx said about Proudhon. A Marxist does not renounce the struggle within the limits of law. Peaceful parliamentarianism and planned compliance with the limits of historical activity set by the Bismarcks and the Bennigsen, the Stolypins, and the Milyukovs. But a Marxist, while utilizing every field, even a reactionary one, for the fight for the revolution, does not stoop to glorify in reaction, does not forget to fight for the best possible field of activity. Therefore, the Marxist is the first to foresee the approach of a revolutionary period, and already begins to rouse the people and to sound the tocsin while the Philistines are still wrapped in their slavish slumber of loyal subjects. The Marxist is therefore the first to take the path of direct revolutionary struggle, marching straight to the battle and exposing the illusions of conciliation cherished by all kinds of social and political facilitators.
Like a what do you call it? Like a pendulum that goes back and forth.
Yeah. Therefore, the Marxist is the last to leave the path of directly revolutionary struggle. He leaves it only when all possibilities have been exhausted, when there is not a shadow of hope for a shorter way, when the basis for an appeal to prepare for mass strike and uprising, etc., is obviously disappearing. Therefore, a Marxist treats with contempt the innumerable renegades of the revolution who shout to him, "We are more progressive than you. We were the first to renounce the revolution. We were the first to submit to the monarchist constitution."
Yeah. Go ahead.
One of two things, Comrade Lauren. Do you believe that there is already no basis for an uprising or for revolution in the narrow sense of the word? If you do, say so openly and prove it in the Marxist way, by an economic analysis, by an appraisal of the political strivings of the various classes, by an analysis of the significance of the different ideological trends. If you have proved it, in that case, we declare that all talk about an uprising is merely phrasemongery. In that case, we shall say, what we had was not a great revolution, but a great bark without bite. Workers, the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie, including the peasants, have betrayed and forsaken you, but on the basis they have created in spite of our efforts. We shall work persistently, patiently, and consistently for a socialist revolution. We will not be so half-hearted and wretched, so rich in words and poor in deeds as the bourgeois revolution. Or do you really believe what you say, Comrade Lauren? Do you really believe that the tide of revolution is rising, that the minor struggles and the sullen discontent will in a matter of 2 or 3 years create a new discontented army and a new serious test, that unrest in the countryside cannot subside? If so, then you must admit that the outburst expressed the strength of the people's anger and not the strength of the backward barbarism. That it is our duty to transform a spontaneous uprising into a planned uprising, and to work persistently and stubbornly for many months, perhaps years, to bring this about, and not to renounce an uprising, as all the Judases are doing.
This is very common that I see in, like, after the Black Lives Matter protests, like last year, after somebody like set a fire to like some gas, what was it, in Minnesota?
The precinct.
Yeah, people were like all like coming like, no, it's like, no, don't renounce that. Just you have to. It sounds like they're angry, so you have to figure out how to channel their anger into a proper, useful manner to get change.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Your present position, however, Comrade Lauren, is precisely one of melancholy and despondency, of hesitant and timid thinking, of putting the blame for your own passivity on our revolution. This and this alone is implied by your jubilant declaration that the boycott was a mistake, is a short-sighted and vulgar jubilation. If it is progressive to renounce the boycott, then it is most progressive people of all. And it is the most progressive of all are the right-wing cadets of Rusikiai Vedomosti.
Russian Vedomosti is like the business, like, yeah, just like the fancy, they're like the Joe Mansions of Russia. There's Russia. Okay. Yeah,
who fought against the boycott of the Boyagin Duma and called on the students to go with their studies and not meddle with the rebellion. We do not envy this renegade progressiveness. We think that to say that it was a mistake to boycott the Witte Duma, which 3 or 4 months before its convocation nobody believed would be convened, and to be silent about the mistake of those who called for participation in the Boyagin Duma, means substituting for materialism of a revolutionary fighter the objectivism of a professor who is cringing
to reaction.
Okay, cringe is the second definition. He means bowing. To bend, the verb, to bend one's head and body in fear or in a servile manner. Okay.
We think that the position of those who were last to enter the Duma, to take the roundabout way, after trying really everything on the direct path of struggle, is better than that of those who were the first to call for entering the Bulgarian Duma on the eve of the popular uprising, which swept it away. The cadet phrase about boycott having been a mistake is particularly unpardonable in Lauren's case, since he truthfully relates that the Mensheviks invented all kinds of shrewd and cunning tactics, ranging from the elective principles and the Zemstvo campaign to uniting the party by participating in the elections with the object of boycotting the Duma. The Mensheviks called upon the workers to elect members to the Duma, although they themselves did not believe that it was right to go into the Duma. We're not the tactics of those more correct who, not believing this, boycotted the Duma, but declared to call the Duma a power, as the Mensheviks called it in their resolutions at the Unity Congress before Muromostov did so. Meant deceiving the people who entered the Duma only after the bourgeois had deserted the direct path of boycott and compelled us to take a circuitous route, though not for the same purpose and not in the same way as the cadets.
Yeah, I mean, everything is true. Like, this is the same kind of debate they were having on electoralism versus direct action. And the Bulgarian Duma was like a total joke. The Tsar could dissolve it, and it was like an advisory Duma. And it's like the nobles had like 50 seats or something, like by blood. And so Lenin was right to say that this gave constitutional illusions, but it was not meant to do anything useful. And so this is kind of like the lesser, every election, in my opinion, is basically this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that a lot of people are already talking about how Democrats will likely lose the Senate, if not the House.
They put that upon themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Which, I mean, is setting the stage even more so.
Yeah, and they bring this upon themselves. And the idea is that they want to limit everything to, there's like, they want to give you the illusion that the Democratic Party can be changed at all. And I don't know if it can be, but you have to come up with you have to know how the Democratic Party works, like to see, like, can Tom Perez unilaterally just ignore everything that, yes, answer is yes. And then he can just appoint his brother who's a lobby. Yes. So basically, the second mistake is that they think that the Democratic Party is going to follow the rules, is supposed to change the rules the minute it's not convenient for them, as they usually do.
Yeah. And I mean, we explicitly saw this in 2016 when WikiLeaks released the, why am I blanking on his name right now? The Clinton's
Podesta
emails. Yes, of course. And to show just the corruption within the party, and none of that has been changed. And I mean, obviously 2020 was a rigging against Sanders again, in my opinion, but not in my opinion. I think that's just fact, but that's just me.
Everyone knows. Yeah, I mean, every election is rigged in America, but how much is kind of, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny because I've actually have some success, like getting right-wingers on my side. It's really funny. So when they said like the Biden election was rigged, I was like, no, I was never like, Biden won fair and fair. It's like, no, every election in America is rigged. And this is how. And then suddenly, like, it gets their excited conspiracy theory mind thinking in more of a dialectical way. And so a lot of, so you'll see that, like, there's always just kind of, you don't have to pretend that election, just because the right reactionaries say it, like, doesn't mean that they're entirely wrong, right?
Right. No, definitely. I mean, usually they have a certain prism, I feel like, but I that kernel of truth, right?
With an enormous husk of reactionary, and the idea is to take their kernel of husk and like kernel of truth and like get at their enormous husk of reactionary incomprehension and make that into corn.
Absolutely, yes.
And so, and I see this too again. Like, they'll say, like, vote for, like, and what I notice is that instead of like voting blue no matter who, what you could do is join the canvas, and then just in the canvas, like, talk to them about different issues. Like, hey, want to have some beer? Okay, when we're canvassing, instead of saying vote for Biden, you can be like, so do you understand how, like, why there are no jobs here. It's because of this, this, and this. Look at this. This is what they could have done in order to keep the jobs, but our government, like, you can do that. Like, and it's not illegal. It's totally cool. Yeah. And they'll probably even vote for Biden because you went there and talked to them, like, about something, whatever that matters for them. Like, so you'll probably be an effective canvasser, but like, there are things you can do to get people to kind of understand, right?
Yeah. And obviously educate yourself in the meanwhile. Oh,
educate yourself a lot. Like, a lot of you like assume to know things, and just check everything, because I don't know, like some basics, like it's like even the most basics are like often wrong, right?
Yeah. I mean, like you end up finding how corrupt the system is just by learning the basics, I feel like.
I know, like before I was not always a tanky. I was willing to be, I was a nuance cuck once. But then like, as I started historically, I was like, my only commitment is that I will always back up whatever I say by historical documents. And then I checked something. Like before going in, I thought that America would be right about 10% of the time. The communists will be right about 90% of the time.
Yeah.
But then when I checked, it's like literally 100%, like 110% of the communists, like the way their media works is that their media is actually like underestimates things. And suddenly you're just like, oh, reality is tanky. And so then you're just like, there's like so many things that make our media, like the information, the media just kind of not, it's like they drop leaflets of information, but they don't tie it together in books, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like the New York Times, if you read like 100 articles on Syria, you can get a reasonable situation. But these 100 articles are dropped in the course of 3 years as opposed to once. And so you'll never be able to tie together the whole situation.
And I've always noticed that like usually it's the most pertinent information either comes out on like a Friday night or something.
Oh, why?
Yeah. And then it's usually like in the second to last paragraph.
I did not know that. What do you have an idea on why?
Oh, no. I mean, I think the purpose is just because no one's reading the newspaper on Friday night.
To kind of make it people. Okay, I got it.
Yeah. Just my reading of that.
You're probably right. Somebody should do a statistical analysis to prove it. So this is his theory. Mm-hmm. And so a theory is like a hypothesis, and then you can actually prove it. And that's kind of how the idea is that the bourgeoisie will never teach you how to win. So you have to come up with your own theories and then verify it to see if your theory is right. And so, yeah. Is there a Patreon, a website, or anything that you want people to visit?
That's a gret question. You can follow me on Twitter.
We'll put that out down here.
Say again?
We'll put it in the description box.
Yes, please do. And then, Esha, I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me again. Would you please come onto my podcast too?
Absolutely. Just let me know when and where.
Yeah, absolutely. We are Villain for All Seasons. We talk about these things all the time as well. We will definitely do a Lenin episode because I think that would.
Oh, absolutely. I would love to do nothing more than talk about Lenin because he is hilarious. Like other things about his life is just hilarious too. Like, like the time he tries, like apparently he invites a Russian weightlifter like in his house, and he can't lift the weightlifter's weight. So then the weightlifter then shows him how to lift weights with the broom. And then so he's practicing lifting with this broom, and his mother-in-law starts cracking up, and he's like, "Mom, you have to be, Mom, be careful. Like I'm seriously practicing." So it's kind of funny.
Yes.
So yeah,
absolutely.
So I'd love to. Just let me know when and where, and we can probably coordinate our schedules.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
Well, thank you for having me again.
And how do people find your podcast?
Yes, my podcast. You can find it on my Twitter. But if you want the actual,
we'll just put it on the description box below.
Load it up there. Our best. You should follow us on Instagram though. That is our best social media site, and that is just VFAS podcast.
Okay.
Instagram.
I will follow my podcast. Will follow your podcast on Instagram.
Yes, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you again. Bye bye.
Bye bye. See you.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Sundays with Lenin. And ultimately, our goal is to get people who've never read Lenin to come on our show and read Lenin. And so if you have a racist uncle that you want to rehabilitate by Thanksgiving, maybe your mom's really awkward and embarrassing and she's a resistance lib, please recommend it to us by tweeting it at Lenin Tweets, because that's how we grow and turn everyone into Lenin fans. Because as we've known throughout history, Lenin fans have done all the revolutions, and people who are not Lenin fans have not done revolutions. So, and 1776 was a counter-revolution. And you can listen to our episode with Gerald Horn at historically.substack.com. And today, our Dutch friend has asked a very good question. Our Dutch friend asked, in the age of legislation and follow due procedures, shouldn't the left more often and systemically refer to Articles 25 and 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to promote socialism? And I'm going to say that outside of the US, maybe that will work. I'm not 100% sure. But in the US, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not help with class consciousness because it's the same in America. There's so little class consciousness that Human Rights Watch in a few years ago actually had a campaign asking China to free the counter-revolutionaries. And that's equivalent to literally, like, usually what counter-revolutionaries have done is, I don't know, like exterminate all the people in the village by hitting their head with a shovel, whatever, like the Holocaust, those kind of things. And so counter-revolutionaries are just terrible people. And the fact that Human Rights Watch actually was able to seriously put out such an article explains how little class consciousness there is. So I believe the biggest problem is in America, they don't understand how to see themselves as a class. I mean, for example, and that's why I think a lot of people who are very poor, who are very downtrodden, can kind of see it. But then the second step is getting organizational, and then suddenly that the police, whatnot, like it just ends up ruining it. So I'd rather promote and the worst thing is the US's BS human rights, like the incubator, they abuse the human rights slogan a billion times over for literally every war. So I'd rather teach people to ignore the idea of human rights because it's dangerous, and in America at least, and then teach them class consciousness, which is going to be much harder. And I don't even know where to begin and how to even target. Like, I can write as many blogs, but I don't even know if it's going to the people who need to hear it. So I guess I would somehow, if possible, I would try to explain class consciousness. So class consciousness is a simple idea. All it is that the way public policy affects, like the way you make money, and people who make money the same way you do, like wage earners versus dividends earners, rent seekers, will be affected differently by different public policies, and that you need to kind of see how people in your class are affected by these so-called public policy. And we see very little class consciousness everywhere. And if you look at any American news from a class conscious point of view, it will be like wrong. So I'm going to say that for other countries where there's more of a class consciousness and you're just trying to get them to buy into the program, it would be a great idea. But in America, we don't even have that. So we have to learn how to build it. And if you have any suggestions on how to build the class consciousness, how do we reach out to people who are watching MSNBC? How do we reach out to people who are watching Fox News? And like where? I feel like we're getting to there's a lot of progressive media, and I feel like we have a nice little bubble, but where do we reach out? How do we reach out? Like, there's so many questions that I do not know the answer to. And if you know any answer, or I would love it. And if you can, just like, if there's a way you can share it with your family members who are a little bit less class conscious than you are, if you are watching me, tanky person, go for it. Like, so I think that is the main problem in America. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. And on this Easter, well, I heard that Lenin's body is better preserved now than it used to be. So maybe one of these Easters he'll wake up. We can always hope, but we don't have that many Easters left with climate change. So, well, keep on reading theory, keep on doing your own activities. So, for example, every one of you can have a little book club and invite people to Marxist reading, which is exactly what Lenin did to start off his, with like having, he and his wife would teach workers how to read and write so that they could get their certificates to become a little higher waged. And then suddenly they did a revolution. So hopefully you guys can start too. And I encourage everyone to actually start your own book club. And if you do, please make a video so we can feature you here on Sundays with Lenin. And just tweet. If you do, just tweet at Lenin_tweets. And with that,